The afternoon sun blazed down as I pulled into my driveway, the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift at the hospital pressing heavy on my shoulders. My only thought was getting inside, kicking off my shoes, and spending a quiet evening with my daughter Lily. But the moment I stepped out of the car, my stomach dropped. A bright, red envelope was taped to my front door, its presence like a slap in the face. Even from a distance, I recognized the logo, Pinecrest Village, HOA. I tore the envelope from the door and ripped it open, my pulse ticking higher with every second. Notice of violation, immediate payment required. My eyes darted to the fine amount, $55. For what? My heart pounded as I scanned further. Grass, exceeding height regulations by 0.5 inches. I nearly laughed out loud at the absurdity. Half an inch, that was it. That was my great offense. The HOA had never been friendly, but this was ridiculous. I had been working double shifts all week, barely had time to sleep, let alone worry about my lawn. As I stood in my driveway, still gripping the notice, I spotted movement across the street. Sandra Wilkins, HOA board secretary and self-appointed neighborhood enforcer, stood watering her perfectly manicured roses. She quickly averted her gaze, but not before I caught the smug smile creeping across her lips. Of course, Sandra had always been a stickler for the rules, but lately she had become more than that. She had turned into something worse, an enforcer, a watchdog, a spy. It was no coincidence that she had been on the HOA board since Richard Walters took over as president. Word around the neighborhood was that Walters, a big-shot real estate developer, had been squeezing residents dry with endless violations and fees, all under the guise of community improvement. I crumpled the letter in my fist and marched inside, tossing it onto the growing pile of bills on my kitchen counter. Since my husband Dan had left 6 months ago, money had been tight. My nursing salary covered the basics, but these random HOA fines were pushing me to the edge. Lily's asthma medication alone was a small fortune, even with insurance. $55 for overgrown grass, that was grocery money. Determined to fight it, I picked up my phone and dialed the HOA office. The line rang 3 times before a flat, uninterested voice answered. Pinecrest Village, HOA. This is Curl. Hi. I just received a fine for my grass being half an inch too tall. That seems excessive, especially since I wasn't even notified there was an issue before getting fined. A sigh came through the phone, the kind that screamed, I don't care. According to our updated bylaws, we no longer require warnings before issuing fines for standard violations, Section 8, Paragraph 4 of the revised agreement. I frowned. Revised agreement? I never signed anything new. The board approved changes last month. Notices were emailed to all residents. Later that night, I checked my email and found it, a 47-page PDF buried between spam offers for diet pills and Nigerian prince scams. Who actually reads those? While I was helping Lily with her homework, a knock at the door made me jump. Standing on my porch was Marcus, my elderly neighbor from 2 houses down, leaning heavily on his cane. Evening, Rachel, he greeted with a knowing look. Wanted to warn you. Sandra's on the warpath. She got me last week for leaving my trash can out 4 hours too long. Cost me $75. That's outrageous. How can they keep raising these fines? Marcus shook his head. It's been worse since that new board president took over. Walters, big-shot real estate guy. Rumor is he's using our fines to fund that fancy clubhouse renovation nobody asked for. Can they even do that? Been wondering the same thing. My nephew's a paralegal, says some of these rules might not even be legal. But fighting an HOA? He sighed. That takes money. Money they know most of us don't have. After Marcus left, I tucked Lily into bed and stayed up researching, and what I found made my blood run cold. HOA abuse was common, and in many cases it was illegal. Some HOAs acted more like small dictatorships than neighborhood associations, but challenging them required time, energy, and worst of all, lawyers. Still, I refused to be bullied. I wasn't paying this fine. I would confront the board at their next meeting instead. I had no idea the nightmare was just beginning. The next morning I woke up to another bright red envelope taped to my door. My heart sank before I even opened it. Another fine, $75. Violation, unauthorized garden structures. I frowned. Garden structures? My backyard had a few vegetable planters and Lily's tiny plastic watering can. That was it. I barely had time to process my frustration when my phone pinged with an email from the HOA. New violation notice. Improper storage of recreational equipment. Fine, $100. My pulse quickened as I read the reason. Your daughter's bicycle was visible from the street for more than 4 hours. I clenched my teeth. This wasn't random anymore. This was personal. Determined to get answers, I stormed to the HOA office during my lunch break. The small beige building sat at the edge of our community like a fortress. complete with security cameras on every corner. Inside, the air was stale, the walls lined with framed certificates and photos of past board presidents, men in stiff suits, smiling like kings, overseeing their kingdom. At the reception desk, Carol, the same uninterested woman from my phone call, barely glanced up from her computer. "Can I help you?" "You can start by explaining why I've suddenly received 2 more fines in less than 24 hours. She exhaled through her nose like I was exhausting her. "Your property has been flagged for multiple violations. All reports were submitted by our neighborhood compliance monitor." I leaned forward. "Let me guess. Sandra Wilkins." Carol didn't confirm, but the flicker in her eyes told me everything. "I want to see the financial records," I demanded. "Where exactly is all this fine money going?" Carol's lips curled into a practiced smile. "All financial records are available by appointment. Office hours are Monday through Friday, 9 to 4. "Great. I'll stop by tomorrow afternoon." "Unfortunately," she said with a feigned look of regret, "our treasurer is out sick. Records won't be available until further notice." Of course they wouldn't. That evening, while helping Lily with her homework, another knock at the door sent a jolt through me. This time, it wasn't Marcus. It was Sandra. She stood on my porch in her perfectly pressed HOA polo, clipboard in hand, an air of smug superiority radiating off her. "Evening, Rachel," she said, her tone sugary sweet. I crossed my arms. "What do you want, Sandra?" She glanced at my front yard like a general inspecting enemy territory. "I just wanted to remind you that our community has high standards, and keeping up with regulations ensures everyone's property values remain stable." I narrowed my eyes. "You mean regulations like my daughter's bicycle or my vegetable garden?" Sandra smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Rules are rules, and you seem to be struggling to follow them." I exhaled sharply. "Cut the act, Sandra. You're targeting me." Her smile didn't falter. "You're drawing a lot of attention to yourself, Rachel. Some people might consider that unwise." I felt my jaw tighten. "Is that a threat?" She tilted her head. "Of course not. Just a friendly warning. You have a lot on your plate. A job, a child, and now all these fines stacking up. Maybe it'd be easier to just stay in compliance rather than stirring up trouble." I took a slow step forward, lowering my voice. "And maybe it'd be easier if you found a new hobby instead of stalking my house." For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Anger. She cleared her throat, flipping a page on her clipboard. "Oh, and I notice your holiday lights are still on your back patio from last year. That's another violation." I laughed. "You're joking." She tapped her pen against her clipboard. "You'll receive official notice in the morning. Have a good night, Rachel." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, heart pounding with fury. By the next day, I wasn't just angry, I was on a mission. I began documenting everything I took, time-stamped photos of my yard, my so-called violations, even the ridiculous height of my grass. I kept copies of every fine, every email, every note. If they wanted to fight, I was going to make damn sure I had proof. And then things escalated. That evening, while Lily and I watered our tiny garden, I felt the prickling sensation of being watched. I turned my head just in time to see a shadow disappear behind Sandra's curtains. My phone buzzed. Another email. HOA violation. Unapproved garden maintenance. Fine, $125. I stared at the screen in disbelief. They were fining me for watering my plants? A sinking feeling settled in my chest. This wasn't just about me being a troublemaker. This was targeted harassment. As I tucked Lily into bed, she asked innocently, "Mommy, why does that lady always look angry at our house?" I kissed her forehead, forcing a reassuring smile. "Some people like rules more than people, sweetheart." But deep down I knew the truth. This wasn't going to stop, and I had a feeling things were about to get worse. The heat hit me the moment I stepped out of my car. The summer sun had been relentless all day, baking the pavement, turning the air into something thick and suffocating. I was already sweating as I walked up my driveway, mentally exhausted from another long shift at the hospital. I just wanted to step inside, crank up the air conditioning, and relax for 5 minutes. But the moment I unlocked the door and flipped the light switch, nothing happened. I frowned and tried again. Nothing. No familiar hum of the refrigerator, no soft whir of the ceiling fan overhead. The house was silent. Too silent. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I walked toward the breaker box, hoping it was just a tripped switch, but every breaker was in its proper place. My heart started pounding. Something was wrong. I grabbed my phone and called the power company, pacing the kitchen as I listened to the automated system drone on. When I finally reached a human voice, I forced myself to stay calm. Hi, I'm calling about an outage at my address. My power just shut off without warning. The representative hesitated before responding, her voice laced with discomfort. Miss Thompson, according to our records, your service was disconnected earlier today. I stopped pacing. Disconnected? There has to be a mistake. My bill is paid. The termination wasn't due to non-payment, she said carefully. It was requested by Pinecrest Village Homeowners Association under their utility oversight agreement. I gripped the phone so tightly my fingers ached. They can't do that. She hesitated again. According to paragraph 37 of your HOA agreement, the board has the authority to request utility disconnections for residents with outstanding violations. I felt the blood rush to my face. Outstanding violations? You mean the fake fines they've been stacking against me? I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't override an HOA request. You'll need to resolve this with them directly. Once they notify us that the issue is settled, we can restore your service, usually within 24 hours. 24 hours. In this heat, with a refrigerator full of groceries, with Lily's asthma medication sitting inside. My throat went dry. I have a child with a medical condition. She needs refrigerated medication. You're telling me the HOA didn't even have to provide a warning before shutting off essential utilities to my home? Another long pause. Then, in a quieter voice, the representative said, I can file an urgent appeal, but it still has to go through HOA approval. I squeezed my eyes shut, my free hand clenching into a fist. Fine. File it. I hung up and immediately dialed Richard Walters. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. I called Sandra next. No answer. I pulled up the HOA emergency contact line, hoping for anything. A robotic voice informed me that messages would be responded to within 24 to 48 hours. Panic settled in, sharp and unforgiving. I rushed to the kitchen, yanking open the fridge. The cool air was already fading. I grabbed Lily's medication and threw it into a cooler with the remaining ice from the freezer, my hands shaking, my pulse pounded in my ears. This wasn't just about pettiness anymore. This wasn't about HOA rules. They were playing with my daughter's health. As I moved through the house, trying to think of a solution, movement outside caught my attention. I stepped to the window, pushing the curtain back just enough to see across the street. Sandra stood at her window, watching. The glow of her living room lamp lit up her face, and I saw it clearly, the small, satisfied smirk tugging at her lips. Something inside me snapped. I stormed to my front door, yanking it open, stepping onto the porch with my fists clenched at my sides. Sandra didn't even flinch. She just took a slow sip from the glass of wine in her hand and turned away, drawing her curtain shut like nothing had happened. My breathing came fast and shallow. The heat, the exhaustion, the injustice of it all pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. My phone buzzed in my hand, and for a second I thought maybe it was someone from the HOA finally calling me back. But it wasn't. It was my cousin Jenna, a reporter. I stared at her name flashing on the screen, and suddenly the answer was crystal clear. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to stay steady as I answered. Hey, Jenna. You said last week you were looking for a new story? She hesitated. Yeah, why? I turned back toward the darkened house. The useless light switches, the coolers sitting on the counter. My eyes drifted toward Sandra's house again, and this time I smiled. Because I've got a hell of a story for you. The news van rolled onto my street just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement. Jenna stepped out first, adjusting the mic clipped to her blazer, her expression sharp with professional determination. Behind her, the cameraman, Dave, and the sound tech, Tina, began setting up, their practiced efficiency making my pulse race. This was real. This was happening. The HOA had picked the wrong homeowner to push around. As the crew prepped, I spotted movement at the end of the street. A sleek silver Mercedes eased onto the block, coming to a slow stop in front of my house. The door opened, and out stepped Richard Walters himself, flanked by two HOA board members, Diane, a tight-lipped woman clutching a clipboard like a shield, and Fred, a nervous-looking man I recognized from the neighborhood. Sandra wasn't with them, but I knew she was watching. I took a slow breath and stepped off my porch, just as Jenna turned to me. Are you ready? She asked under her breath. I nodded. Let's do this. Jenna pivoted smoothly toward the camera, her voice slipping into the polished cadence of a seasoned reporter. Good evening. I'm Jenna Rivera with Channel 7 News, reporting live from Pinecrest Village, where a homeowner claims her HOA has unjustly disconnected her electricity over a disputed fine. We're here to get answers. Richard's face twitched as he realized the camera was already rolling. He straightened his expensive suit, then stepped forward, his politician's smile firmly in place. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," he began, voice smooth as oil. "The Homeowners Association enforces community standards to maintain property values. Miss Thompson has been repeatedly non-compliant with regulations, leaving us no choice but to take corrective action." Jenna didn't blink. "By cutting off electricity to a home where a child with asthma lives?" Diane shuffled her papers, clearing her throat. "Mr. Thompson received multiple warnings about her violations." I stepped in before they could spin the narrative further. "I received one fine, $55. No warning, no grace period. Since then, I've been fined over $300 for things like my daughter's bicycle being outside for 4 hours and my vegetable garden existing. Then, without notice, my power was shut off. This isn't about community standards. This is harassment." Fred looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, but Richard kept his cool. "We followed proper procedures." Jenna held up a printed document. "Actually, the state's utility protection laws require written notification specifically mentioning utility disconnection as a consequence and a minimum 7-day grace period. Did Ms. Thompson receive that notice?" Silence. Richard's jaw tightened. "Our legal team has reviewed." "Your legal team?" A voice cut in from the gathering crowd. It was Mrs. Jenkins, my elderly neighbor, arms crossed over her chest. "Last month, the board told us we couldn't afford legal counsel, which is why you raised our HOA dues. So which is it, Mr. Walters? No money for lawyers, or an entire legal team to justify shutting off a single mother's electricity?" A murmur rippled through the growing crowd of neighbors. Richard shot a glare at Diane, who was now clutching her clipboard like it might physically protect her. Jenna pressed forward. "Sir, do you have a copy of the board meeting minutes where these fines were approved, or where Miss Thompson was formally notified of pending disconnection?" Diane flipped frantically through her papers, but I could see it in her face. There was nothing. Richard's smile thinned. "This interview is over." He turned to leave, but before he could make it to his car, Maria, another neighbor, stepped forward. "They fined me $100 for having a bird feeder," she called out, her voice shaking. "Miguel had to repaint his front door because the color wasn't approved. Even Mrs. Jenkins got fined for wind chimes. And now they're cutting off power?" More voices joined in, more stories of outrageous fines, threats, intimidation tactics. Richard's escape route was closing. Then Sandra appeared. She stormed into the frame, waving her phone. "These people are rule breakers," she snapped. "I have photos." Jenna turned the mic toward her. "So you've been surveilling your neighbors?" Sandra faltered. I was making sure." "And did the HOA authorize you to photograph private residences and their children?" Sandra's face drained of color. She turned sharply, storming back toward her house, but it was too late. The story had already been told. The camera panned across the angry faces of my neighbors, capturing the fire in their eyes, the momentum that had built into something unstoppable. And Richard knew it. Jenna turned back to the camera. "We've just received word that the mayor's office has been notified and a formal investigation into HOA abuse of power is being launched." Richard Walters' carefully curated composure finally cracked. He turned on his heel and climbed into his Mercedes without another word, speeding off into the night. As the red taillights disappeared, the first cheer erupted from the crowd. Then another. And suddenly neighbors were clapping, hugging, exchanging contact information. A community that had been afraid to speak out had just found its voice. Jenna turned to me, mic lowered, a small grin tugging at the corner of her mouth. "You just blew this thing wide open." I exhaled, feeling the weight I had been carrying for weeks finally start to lift. But I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the fallout had already begun. The news segment had gone viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing, calls from reporters, messages from neighbors, even strangers, sharing their own HOA horror stories. But the most important call came just after 9 a.m. "This is Linda Garza from the mayor's office," the voice on the other end said, professional but firm. "We've received multiple complaints regarding Pinecrest Village HOA, and after last night's news report, the city attorney is launching a formal investigation." I gripped my phone tighter. "So, what does that mean?" "It means you're not alone," she said. "And it means Walters and his board have a serious problem." She wasn't wrong. By noon, the HOA office was in chaos. Residents gathered outside, waving printed copies of fines, emails, and violation notices. The once untouchable fortress was now under siege by the very people it had terrorized. As I walked toward the building, Maria hurried up beside me, her face lit with urgency. "You won't believe what we found," she whispered, thrusting a thick envelope into my hands. "Financial records. Walters tried to hide them, but a friend of mine got a hold of some documents. I flipped through the pages, my stomach tightening with every line. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in HOA funds were funneled into a company called Evergreen Solutions, a landscaping business that didn't actually exist. The registered owner? Walters' brother-in-law. My blood boiled. This wasn't just about power-hungry HOA rules anymore. This was fraud. Just as I looked up, Richard Walters himself arrived. He stepped out of his Mercedes, his usual smug expression replaced with a tight-lipped grimace. He adjusted his cufflinks, feigning composure, but I saw the stiffness in his posture. The moment he approached the door, Jenna and her news crew materialized from the crowd, cameras rolling. "Mr. Walters," Jenna called out, her voice steady and sharp, "can you comment on the allegations that Pinecrest Village HOA has been misusing homeowner funds?" Walters barely glanced at her. "No comment." "What about the fraudulent landscaping contracts?" Jenna pressed. "It appears the HOA has been funneling money into a fake company linked to your family." The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs. Walters stiffened, his jaw locking. "This is slander." "I won't stand for it." "Then show us the real financial records," I said, stepping forward, holding up the documents Maria had given me, "unless you have something to hide." The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Walter's gaze flicked around, his mind racing for an escape, but there wasn't one. Not this time. Just then 2 uniformed officers approached from the sidewalk. One of them, a stern-looking man in a navy suit, flashed a badge. "Richard Walters, I'm Detective Coleman with the Financial Crimes Unit. We have a warrant to search the HOA office and seize all records." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Walters' face drained of color. "This is a mistake," he started, but the officers weren't interested in excuses. One of them pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "Mr. Walters, you're under investigation for fraud, misappropriation of funds, and financial misconduct." The next few seconds felt surreal. Walters barely had time to stammer before the officer took his arm, turned him around, and placed him in handcuffs. The click of metal locking into place sent a ripple of shocked silence through the crowd. And then, people clapped, some even whistled. I could feel years of pent-up frustration exploding all at once as Walters was led to the patrol car. Diane and Fred stood frozen, looking like rats on a sinking ship. "The HOA board is hereby dissolved," Detective Coleman announced, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Any fines collected under fraudulent pretenses will be reviewed and refunded." Maria grabbed my hand and squeezed. We had won. The sun was beginning to set when I finally stepped onto my porch, exhaustion weighing on me. But for the first time in weeks, it wasn't from stress or fear. It was the exhaustion of victory. Richard Walters had been taken away in handcuffs. The HOA board had crumbled. The fraudulent fines were being reviewed, but the real win wasn't just the downfall of the people who had tormented this neighborhood. It was what had risen in their place. As I stood there, watching the street, something was different. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves were standing in groups, talking, laughing, sharing stories of the nightmare we had all lived through. Maria was going door to door, collecting signatures for a new community charter, one designed to ensure no single person or small group could ever hold unchecked power again. Jason, who had been fined for letting his son's baseball team celebrate on his lawn, was grilling burgers in his driveway, calling out to people to grab a plate. Mrs. Jenkins, our resident historian, was flipping through a thick notebook, marking down names of those interested in joining a real neighborhood committee, not one controlled by arbitrary rules and fines, but one built on cooperation, fairness, and transparency. I exhaled slowly, letting the moment sink in. For so long this place had felt like a prison, controlled by a group of people who wielded power like a weapon. But now it felt like something entirely new, something alive. Lily ran up to me, her curls bouncing with every step, her tiny hands clutching a sunflower someone had given her. "Mommy, can we plant this in our garden?" she asked, her eyes bright with excitement. I smiled, crouching down to her level. "Of course, sweetheart, this is our home. No one can tell us otherwise." As I stood, I noticed a new sign being hammered into the ground where the HOA office once loomed. It wasn't a warning about rules or restrictions. It wasn't a list of fines or regulations. It was a welcome sign. Pinecrest Village, a community, not a corporation. A lump formed in my throat. We had done it. We had turned the tables. But as I turned to head inside, a familiar, uneasy feeling crept up my spine. Across the street, tucked in the shadows near the tree line, a figure stood watching. They weren't part of the celebration. They weren't talking with neighbors. They were just standing there, still and silent. A car passed, momentarily illuminating the figure's face. My breath hitched. Sandra. She wasn't smiling anymore. She wasn't holding a clipboard or a violation notice. She was just watching. I felt a chill despite the summer heat. I wasn't afraid of her, not anymore, but I knew the look in her eyes. This wasn't over. It never really was.